The snow out here had a way of eating sound. It would swallow the wind, the cry of a hawk, the crack of a falling branch, leaving behind a silence so total it felt like the whole world was holding its breath. And in that silence, Margaret Holloway sat alone. She'd been alone for years, ever since they put her husband in the frozen ground. The fire in the hearth was her only company, its light dancing across a face that had forgotten how to smile. The loneliness wasn't just in the cabin, it was in her bones, pressing down on her until she felt like she might just crumble into dust. The folks in town, they didn't talk to her. They talked about her. "That Holloway woman," they'd whisper, "livin' out there with the ghosts and the wolves." She heard the whispers, felt 'em like little shards of ice in her gut, but she learned to pretend she didn't. It was easier that way. Easier than reaching for a hand that would never reach back. That night, the storm came in with a fury. It clawed at the walls of her little cabin, screaming through the pines. Maggie checked the latch on the door, then checked it again. She was safe. She was alone. She was always alone. And just as the fire sank to embers, just as the silence became absolute, she heard it. A knock. It was so soft she thought she'd imagined it. A trick of the wind. But then it came again, harder this time. A fist against the wood, followed by voices, low and rough, chewed up by the gale. "Ma'am," a voice cut through the storm. "Can we stay one night?" Her heart slammed against her ribs. No one ever came out here, not ever. The road was miles away. Her neighbors kept their distance. Her whole life was built on the simple fact that no one would ever knock on her door. And now there were men at her door. In the middle of the worst storm of the year. Every story she'd ever heard, every dark tale of what happens to a woman alone, flooded her mind. Her hand drifted toward the rifle mounted over the fireplace. Her fingers trembled. She took her lantern, the light shaking in her hand, and pulled the door open just a crack. 3 of them. They were mountains of men, covered in snow, their shoulders as broad as the doorway. The oldest one stepped into the light. His eyes were calm, steady. "We mean no harm," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Just need a roof till dawn." Behind him, a second man shifted on his feet, all restless energy, his beard a wild mess of red and ice. The third was younger, almost a boy, but built solid. They looked like they'd been carved right out of the mountain itself. And they looked dangerous. Maggie's mind screamed at her. Trust no one. Give nothing. Lock the door. This was the first rule of survival, a rule she'd lived by for years. But there was something in the old man's eyes. Not a threat. Not a plea. Just waiting. And in that moment, she heard her own loneliness howling back at her from the empty corners of the cabin. She pulled the door open. "One night," she said, her voice a thin, brittle thing. "No more." They stomped the snow from their boots, and the small cabin suddenly felt tiny, the air thick with the smell of wet wool and cold pine. The room seemed to shrink around their massive frames. Maggie took a step back, pulling her shawl tight. She felt small, she felt breakable. She had just let the wolves into the fold. The only sounds were the hiss of snow melting on the hearth and the howl of the wind outside. They warmed their hands at her fire, saying nothing. She watched them, every little movement, every glance. The oldest one, Jedediah, he called himself, moved with a slow, deliberate grace. The red-bearded one, Rufus, paced the floor like a caged animal. The young one, Thaddeus, tried to fill the silence with nervous chatter, but Maggie just nodded, her eyes never leaving them. She made them coffee, her hands shaking. "What have you done, Maggie?" The question echoed in her head. The whole town would know by morning. The shame was already crawling up her throat, hot and bitter. A woman alone couldn't have men under her roof. It was a rule, unwritten but absolute. But when Jedediah took the cup from her, his scarred fingers brushing hers, and murmured a quiet, "Thank you." Something inside her softened. A place she thought had frozen solid years ago. And that scared her more than anything. The storm raged on. Rufus, the restless one, noticed the latch on her door was broken. Without a word, he picked up her tools and fixed it. His hands, though scarred and rough, were surprisingly deft. Thaddeus told stories of tracking bears, his laughter echoing in the small space, a sound so alien and so welcome it made Maggie's chest ache. Jedediah mostly just watched the fire, his face a mask of secrets. Maggie sat in her rocking chair, pretending to sew, but her every nerve was on fire. She watched Jedediah's hands as he split more kindling. There was power in them, but there was a gentleness too, a control. She was starting to feel something other than fear, a flicker of warmth, a dangerous, foolish flicker. And that's when she saw it. As Jedediah leaned forward to place a log on the fire, his coat fell open for just a second. Tucked into his belt, the firelight glinted off the cold, hard steel of a pistol. It wasn't a hunter's gun. It was a Colt Peacemaker. A gunslinger's gun. Her blood ran cold. These weren't travelers. They weren't lost. They had come to her cabin for a reason. And she had a terrible feeling she knew what it was. The fear came back, sharp and sudden. This wasn't kindness. It was a performance. A lie to get them inside her walls. Once the storm passed, what then? Would they leave? Or would the masks come off? Her mind raced, twisting and turning. She thought about the rifle above the mantel. Could she even use it? Could she kill a man? She glanced at Rufus, who was watching her, his eyes narrowed. He knew she'd seen the gun. The air in the cabin crackled with a new tension, thick and suffocating. The stories Thaddeus told now seemed less like harmless tales and more like boasts, descriptions of a life lived on the edge of violence. Rufus's pacing was no longer restlessness. It was predatory. And Jedediah's silence felt heavy, calculating. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one brewing within her four walls. Then, near midnight, something shifted. Rufus, the one who unnerved her the most, stood up and went to the window. He stared out at the loose shutter banging in the wind, a frantic, desperate sound. Without a word to anyone, he pulled on his coat and stepped out into the blizzard. Maggie watched through a crack in the door. The wind tore at him, plastering his coat to his body. He fought his way to the shutter, his hands bare, and hammered it back into place. The frantic banging stopped. When he came back inside, covered in a fresh layer of snow, he didn't look at her. He just went back to his spot by the fire. It wasn't the act of a man trying to trick her. It was the act of a man who couldn't stand the sound of something broken. And in that moment, Maggie's certainty wavered. Who were these men? Were they the wolves she feared, or were they something else entirely? As she banked the coals for the night, her shawl slipped from her shoulders. Jedediah's eyes met hers. It wasn't a look of hunger. It was something else. Something steady. Something that saw right through her. She turned away, a strange heat rising in her chest. She lay in her bed, listening to the sound of them breathing on the floor of her cabin. 3 armed strangers. And for the first time in years, she wasn't entirely afraid. But as sleep pulled at her, a single, chilling thought surfaced. Jedediah's pistol wasn't the only thing she'd seen. Tucked under his bedroll, barely visible in the dim light, was a leather satchel. And sticking out of it was the corner of a piece of paper. A wanted poster. She had only caught a glimpse of the face. But the name. She saw the name clearly. And it was a name she knew. The name of the man who had supposedly helped her bury her husband. The morning light was pale and thin, like watered-down milk. Maggie woke with a jolt, the memory of the wanted poster burning in her mind. Her husband's friend. The man who had shown her so much kindness after the funeral. A wanted man. And these 3 men were here, in her cabin, with his poster. It all clicked into place with a horrifying certainty. They weren't just gunslingers. They were bounty hunters. And they were hunting him. They thought he was here. Jedediah was already awake, tending the fire. He looked up and met her gaze, and it was like he knew. He knew that she knew. A silent understanding passed between them. The storm hadn't broken. The drifts were piled high against the door. They weren't leaving, and she was trapped in the middle of a hunt. The next 2 days were a blur of tension. The men worked, chopping wood, shoveling snow, their presence a constant, heavy weight. Rufus worked with a grim fury, as if he were fighting the snow itself. Thaddeus tried to keep things light, but his jokes fell flat in the charged air. Jedediah was quiet, watchful. He watched the tree line. He watched the road. He watched her. Maggie felt like a fly caught in a spider's web. She was a pawn in a game she didn't understand. Why was her husband's friend a wanted man? What had he done? And why did these men think he would come here, to her isolated cabin? The whispers from town started on the 3rd day. A neighbor rode past, his eyes lingering on the 3 strange horses in her yard. She knew what he was thinking. The Holloway widow had taken in men. The shame was a physical thing, a hot poker in her gut. She had done nothing wrong, but in their eyes she was already guilty. That night, she couldn't eat. She sat by the fire, her hands trembling. The men sat at the table, their voices low murmurs. She was their host, but she felt like their prisoner. It was Rufus who finally broke the silence. He stood in front of her, blocking the firelight, his face a thundercloud. "You think we don't see it?" he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "The way you look at us, like we're poison. We keep your fire lit, we keep the roof from caving in, and you look at us like we're dirt." His words hit her hard, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. She had been judging them, fearing them, even as they helped her. Rufus's eyes weren't angry. They were hurt. "Enough, Rufus." Jedediah's voice was quiet, but it cut through the tension like a knife. Rufus backed down, but the damage was done. The cabin felt even smaller, the air thick with unspoken things. Later, after Thaddeus had fallen asleep, Rufus started talking. He told her about his wife and daughter, about how they'd been caught in the crossfire of a bank robbery gone wrong, how he'd hunted the men responsible, one by one. But there was one left. The leader. The man on the wanted poster. He wasn't just a bounty to Rufus. He was the ghost that haunted his every waking moment. His confession hung in the air, raw and painful. And Maggie understood. This wasn't about money for him. It was about vengeance. Then Jedediah spoke. His story was different. He and the wanted man, a man named Silas, had been partners once. Prospectors. They had struck it rich, a vein of gold so thick it was like a river running through the rock. But Silas had gotten greedy. He'd taken it all, left Jedediah for dead in a collapsed mine shaft, and vanished. "The gold is still out there," Jedediah said, his eyes fixed on the flames. "And Silas is the only one who knows where." Now she saw the full picture. One man hunting for vengeance, the other for fortune, and she was stuck in the middle. The storm finally broke the next morning. A cold, bright sun lit up a world buried in white. It was time for them to leave. Maggie stood in the doorway, watching them pack their horses. A strange ache filled her chest. For 3 days, her cabin had been filled with life. Now, the silence was about to return. It should have been a relief. But it wasn't. Jedediah finished last. He turned to her, his breath making clouds in the frigid air. He didn't ask to stay. He just looked at her, his eyes patient, waiting. The choice was hers. Let them ride out of her life, back to their hunt, and leave her to her loneliness. Or... What? What was the alternative? Her lips parted. A word, a whisper she didn't even know was there, escaped. Stay. It was barely a sound, but he heard it. A flicker of something in his eyes. A slight easing of the tension in his shoulders. He didn't smile, but he didn't have to. Rufus and Thaddeus looked back, surprised. And in that moment, Maggie knew she had just changed everything. She had chosen a side. The problem was, she still wasn't sure it was the winning one. She had invited the storm inside, and now she had to see it through. As Jedediah unsaddled his horse, his eyes scanned the tree line again. He was still watching, still waiting. It wasn't over, it was just beginning. And that's when a thought hit her, so cold and sharp it stole her breath. They weren't just waiting for Silas to show up. They were using her as bait. The day after she asked them to stay, the real work began. Jedediah walked the perimeter of her property, his eyes missing nothing. He wasn't just looking for tracks in the snow. He was reading the land, learning its secrets. He pointed out sight lines, ambush points, escape routes she'd never even considered. Her cozy little cabin was no longer a home. It was a fortress, or a trap. Rufus spent hours sharpening knives, cleaning their rifles, his movements economical and deadly. Thaddeus, for all his youthful energy, turned out to be a crack shot, able to hit a pine cone from 100 yards. They were a unit, a well-oiled machine of violence, and she was living in their barracks. They didn't talk about Silas directly, but his name was a ghost in the room. They called him the target, or simply him. They talked about his habits, his cruelty, his cunning. He wasn't just a criminal. He was a monster, a shadow that stretched all the way from Rufus's past to this very cabin. Maggie tried to go about her days as normal, but nothing was normal. Every creak of the floorboards, every snap of a branch outside sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. She was living on a knife's edge. One afternoon, while fetching water from the well, she found it. A single fresh boot print in the snow, just inside the tree line. It wasn't Jedediah's. It wasn't Rufus's or Thaddeus's. She stared at it, her heart pounding. He was out there, watching them. She backed away slowly, the bucket of water forgotten. When she told Jedediah, his face became grim. He didn't seem surprised. He seemed vindicated. "He knows we're here," he said, his voice low. "He's testing us." The pressure inside the cabin ratcheted up another notch. The easy camaraderie of the first few days was gone, replaced by a tense, watchful silence. Rufus's temper frayed, and he and Thaddeus got into a shouting match over a misplaced skinning knife. Jedediah had to step between them, his presence the only thing that kept them from coming to blows. Maggie retreated further into herself. She felt a growing resentment. This was her home. They had brought their war to her doorstep. But then, late one night, as she sat mending a tear in Rufus's coat, he started talking. He told her about his daughter, how she had loved to collect wildflowers, how her laugh had been the brightest sound in the world. As he spoke, the hardened killer melted away, and all that was left was a grieving father, a man broken by loss, and Maggie's resentment softened into a reluctant empathy. The next evening, Jedediah found her by the window, staring out at the darkening woods. "You're scared," he said. It wasn't a question. "They say he's a devil," she whispered, not looking at him. "They say he enjoys it." "He's just a man," Jedediah replied, his voice steady. "And all men have weaknesses." He moved to stand beside her, his shoulder almost touching hers. The warmth from his body seemed to push back the fear. "He's arrogant," Jedediah continued. "He likes to play games. He'll want to get inside our heads before he makes his move. He'll try to turn us against each other." The very next day, it started. A dead raven was left on her doorstep, a single black feather tied to its leg. It was a message, a threat. Thaddeus was spooked, but Rufus just cursed, his hand going to his gun. Jedediah studied the bird, his face unreadable. "He's getting closer," was all he said. That night, Maggie couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about her husband, about Silas, the man she had thought was his friend. Had her husband known? Had he been involved in this somehow? The questions were a poison, seeping into every memory she had of the man she had loved. She got up and went to his old trunk at the foot of her bed. She hadn't opened it in years. Her hands trembled as she lifted the heavy lid. Inside were his clothes, his books, his tools. And at the very bottom, tucked inside a hollowed-out book, was a small leather-bound journal. Her heart stopped. She had never seen it before. She opened it. The first few pages were just notes about the farm, the weather, the price of feed. But then, the entries changed. He wrote about a discovery in the woods, a hidden cave, and inside the cave, something he shouldn't have found. He wrote about a man named Silas, about a partnership, about a fortune in stolen gold, and about his growing fear that Silas was not the man he claimed to be. Her husband hadn't been an innocent victim. He had been Silas's partner. He had helped him hide the gold, and Silas had killed him to keep the secret. The whole world tilted on its axis. Her entire life, her grief, her loneliness, it was all built on a lie. She looked up from the journal, her eyes finding Jedediah's across the dark room. He was awake, watching her, and in his eyes, she saw not surprise, but a deep, sorrowful confirmation. He had known. He had known all along who her husband was, and he hadn't told her. The sense of betrayal was a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. She wasn't just bait. She was the key. Her land, her home, was the hiding place. And these men, these strangers she had let into her life, had used her, lied to her, and watched as she mourned a man who was nothing like she remembered. The trust she had started to build crumbled into ash. She was alone again, truly alone, surrounded by men who all wanted something from her. And outside, in the darkness, a killer was waiting. The revelation in the journal shattered the fragile peace of the cabin. Maggie felt a cold fury she hadn't known she was capable of. She slammed the journal shut and faced Jedediah, her eyes blazing. "You knew," she hissed, her voice shaking with rage. "You knew what he was. You let me believe he was a good man." Jedediah didn't deny it. He just nodded slowly, his face etched with a weariness that went bone deep. "I wasn't sure," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Not until we got here. I saw the way you looked at his memory. I couldn't take that from you." "Take it from me?" she repeated, her laugh sharp and bitter. "You didn't have the right to decide what I should know. It was my life, my lie." Rufus and Thaddeus were awake now, watching the confrontation unfold. The battle lines were drawn. It was them against her. "Where is it, Maggie?" Rufus demanded, his patience gone. "Where's the gold?" "I don't know!" she cried, and it was the truth. The journal mentioned a cave, but not its location. Only landmarks, a twisted pine, a rock that looked like a sleeping bear. It could be anywhere on her 100 acres of woods. "She's lying!" Rufus snarled, taking a step toward her. Jedediah put out an arm, blocking his path. "Leave her be, Rufus. She'll help us." "Will I?" Maggie challenged, her chin high. "Why should I? You're no better than he is. All of you are just thieves and killers, fighting over stolen money on my land." The accusation hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. For a moment, no one spoke. The fire crackled, spitting embers onto the hearth. The trust was gone. The alliance was broken. From that moment on, the cabin was a prison of suspicion. Maggie refused to help them, and they watched her every move, convinced she was hiding the map from them. The unspoken threat of violence was a constant presence. She was a woman alone with 3 armed, desperate men. The fear was back, colder and more intimate than before. 2 days later, another message from Silas appeared. This one was more personal. Pinned to her door with a hunting knife was a small, faded blue ribbon. The ribbon she had worn in her hair on her wedding day. Her husband must have kept it. Silas must have found it. The message was clear. I know you. I can get to you. I can take anything I want. A wave of nausea washed over her. This man, this monster, had been in her home. He had gone through her dead husband's things. He had touched her memories. That night, something inside her broke. The grief, the betrayal, the fear. It all coalesced into a hard, cold resolve. Silas had taken her husband. He had taken her past. He would not take her future. She would not be a victim in this story. She would not be a pawn. She would be a player. She spent the entire next day rereading her husband's journal, cross-referencing his descriptions with her own intimate knowledge of the land. She knew every tree, every rock, every creek on this mountain, the twisted pine, the sleeping bear rock. She knew the place. She knew where the cave was. But she didn't tell them. She had her own plan. She would lead them to the gold, yes. But she would do it on her own terms. That evening, she approached Jedediah. I know where it is, she said, her voice steady. Hope flared in his eyes, but she held up a hand. I'll take you there, she said. But we do this my way. No guns, not until we see him. Rufus scoffed. That's insane. He'll kill us all. He wants the gold, Maggie said, her gaze unwavering. He won't risk damaging it in a firefight. He'll wait. He'll try to take it from us after we've done the hard work. And when he does, we'll be ready for him. On my ground. Jedediah studied her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers. He saw the steel there, the unbending will. He had wanted a pawn, but he had found a queen. All right, Maggie, he said, giving a slow nod. Your ground, your rules. Rufus protested, but Jedediah silenced him with a look. A new alliance was forged, this one not of trust, but of mutual desperation. They had a common enemy, and for now, that was enough. As they prepared for the next day's trek, Maggie felt a strange sense of calm. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was no longer in control. She was walking into the lion's den, but this time, she was the one setting the trap. The next morning, they set out at dawn. The air was crisp and cold, the snow crunching under their boots. Maggie led the way, Jedediah, Rufus, and Thaddeus following in a single file line behind her. As they had agreed, they carried no rifles, only pistols tucked away under their heavy coats. The woods were silent, watchful. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Maggie's senses were on high alert. She was walking the same paths she had walked 1,000 times before, but today they felt different, alien. This was enemy territory. She led them deep into the woods, to a part of her property she rarely visited. The trees grew thick here, their branches blocking out the sun. It was a place of deep shadows and secrets. Finally, she stopped in front of a massive rock formation, one that, from a certain angle, did indeed look like a bear curled up for the winter. The sleeping bear rock, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Tucked behind it, almost completely hidden by a tangle of overgrown bushes, was a narrow opening. The entrance to the cave. A wave of nervous energy passed through the men. This was it. The culmination of their long hunt. Jedediah pulled aside the bushes, peering into the darkness. A wave of cold, musty air washed over them. He's been here, Rufus said, pointing to a set of fresh tracks in the mud just inside the entrance. Silas knew they were coming. It was a trap. Every instinct screamed at them to turn back, but the lure of the gold was too strong. We stick to the plan, Jedediah said, his eyes meeting Maggie's. Maggie, you wait here. If we're not back in an hour, you run. No, she said, her voice firm. This is my land, my fight. I'm going in. Before he could argue, she slipped past him into the cave. The darkness was total. Jedediah lit a lantern, the flickering light casting long, dancing shadows on the damp rock walls. The cave was a narrow, winding passage that sloped deep into the earth. The air was cold and heavy, the silence broken only by the drip, drip, drip of water from the ceiling. They moved slowly, cautiously, their hands on their holstered pistols. Every step echoed in the oppressive silence. They were walking deeper and deeper into the belly of the beast. After what felt like an eternity, the passage opened up into a large chamber. And in the center of the chamber, they saw it. Stacked against the far wall were a dozen heavy, locked wooden chests. The gold. For a moment they just stared, mesmerized by the sight. The fortune that had cost so many lives. Rufus let out a low whistle, his eyes wide with greed. Thaddeus looked like a kid on Christmas morning. Even Jedediah seemed to be in awe. But Maggie wasn't looking at the gold. She was looking at the shadows. And that's when they heard it. A low, mocking chuckle that seemed to come from the walls themselves. "Took you long enough," a voice echoed from the darkness. A figure stepped out from behind a pillar of rock. Silas. He was smaller than Maggie had imagined, wiry and quick, with cold, dead eyes that seemed to see right through her. He held a rifle in his hands, aimed directly at Jedediah's chest. "Jedediah," he said, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "Good to see you again. I see you brought the widow. How convenient." Two more men emerged from the shadows behind him, both heavily armed. They were outnumbered, outgunned. The trap had been sprung. "It's over, Silas," Jedediah said, his voice calm, steady. "Give it up." Silas laughed again, a harsh, grating sound. "Give it up? I don't think so. I think you're going to help me carry my gold out of here. And then, well, the widow's cabin is so isolated. It would be a shame if it were to have a tragic fire. With 4 bodies inside." The threat hung in the cold air. This was it. The final stand. Maggie's heart was pounding so hard she thought it would burst. She had led them all to their deaths. But then she remembered. Her ground. Her rules. She looked past Silas, into the deeper darkness of the cave behind him. She knew this cave. Her husband's journal had described it in detail. And he had mentioned something else. A second exit. A narrow crawl space hidden behind a rockfall at the back of the chamber. An escape route. A wicked idea, born of desperation and rage, began to form in her mind. Silas thought he had them trapped. But in these mountains, nothing is ever what it seems. Silas's grin was pure poison. "Drop the pistols," he commanded, his rifle steady on Jedediah. Slowly, Jedediah, Rufus, and Thaddeus did as he said, their guns thudding onto the cave floor. They were helpless. Maggie's mind was racing. The back exit. It was their only chance. But how to get to it? How to create a diversion? Her eyes darted around the chamber. The lantern sat on the floor, its light flickering. The chests of gold were stacked high. And everywhere there were shadows. Deep, dark shadows. "You always were a snake, Silas," Jedediah said, his voice a low growl. He was stalling, buying her time. "And you were always a fool," Silas shot back. "Trusting, honorable. Look where it got you." He gestured with his rifle toward the gold. "Now, start loading up. You first, Redbeard. You look strong." Rufus glared at him, his fists clenched, but he started moving toward the chests. This was her moment. Maggie took a deep breath. And then she screamed. It was a raw, terrified sound that echoed off the walls of the cave, making everyone jump. In that split second of surprise, she kicked the lantern with all her might. It flew through the air, hit the rock wall, and shattered. The cave was plunged into absolute darkness. Chaos erupted. Men shouted. A gun went off, the flash momentarily illuminating a scene of confusion. Maggie didn't wait. She scrambled backward into the darkness toward the back of the chamber where the journal said the escape route was. "Maggie!" she heard Jedediah yell. "It's a trick!" Silas screamed. "Find them! Shoot them!" Another gun fired, the bullet whining past her ear. She crawled on her hands and knees, her fingers searching for the loose pile of rocks her husband had described. She found it. A small, low opening, barely big enough to squeeze through. She wriggled into the tight space, rocks scraping her back. Behind her, she could hear the sounds of a desperate fight. Grunts of pain. The sickening thud of a fist hitting flesh. A third gunshot, followed by a scream. She had to keep going. She pulled herself through the narrow passage, emerging into another, smaller tunnel. She could hear them coming after her. She ran, stumbling in the dark, her only guide the faint draft of air that suggested another opening. The tunnel twisted and turned. She could hear Silas cursing behind her, his voice getting closer. "You can't hide from me, widow," he yelled. "This whole mountain is my territory." But he was wrong. It wasn't his mountain. It was hers. She emerged from the tunnel into another small cave, this one with a faint glimmer of light coming from a crack in the ceiling high above. It wasn't an exit. It was a dead end. She was trapped. She heard them entering the tunnel behind her. There was nowhere left to run. She pressed herself back against the rock wall, her heart hammering. This was it. This was where she would die. Then she heard a different sound. Not from the tunnel she had just left, but from the shadows on the other side of the small cave. A low growl. A pair of yellow eyes blinked open in the darkness. It was a mountain lion. It must have been using the cave as its den. Silas and his men emerged from the tunnel, their eyes adjusting to the dim light. They saw her, trapped against the wall. Silas raised his rifle, a triumphant sneer on his face, and then the cat attacked. It was a blur of teeth and claws, a scream of fury. It launched itself from the shadows directly onto one of Silas's men. The man went down, screaming. Silas, startled, fired his rifle, the shot going wild. The cave was filled with the sounds of the struggle, the snarls of the cat, the terrified screams of the man. And in that moment of chaos, a figure emerged from the tunnel behind Silas. It was Jedediah. He must have followed her. He held a large rock in his hands, and he brought it down with all his force on the back of Silas's head. Silas crumpled to the ground without a sound. The other gunman, seeing his boss go down and the cat mauling his friend, panicked. He turned and fled back into the darkness of the tunnels. Jedediah didn't hesitate. He grabbed Maggie's arm. "Come on!" he yelled over the sounds of the attack. They scrambled back through the tunnel, leaving the mountain lion to its gruesome work. They didn't stop running until they were out of the cave, blinking in the bright sunlight, gasping for air. They looked back just in time to see Rufus and Thaddeus stumble out of the main entrance, bruised and bloody, but alive. It was over. Silas was down. The gold was still in the cave. And they had survived. They stood there for a long moment, the four of them, in the silent woods. The adrenaline started to fade, replaced by a profound exhaustion. Maggie looked at Jedediah. He was bleeding from a cut on his forehead. His clothes were torn, but his eyes were clear. He had saved her. She had saved him. The war for the gold was over, but Maggie knew a different battle was just beginning. The battle for what came next. They never went back for the gold. They sealed the entrance to the cave with rocks and dynamite, burying the fortune and its curse forever. The body of Silas and his man were left to the mountain. It seemed a fitting end. They returned to the cabin, weary and battered. The tension was gone, replaced by a quiet, shared understanding. They had been through the fire together and had come out the other side. Changed. Rufus, his quest for vengeance finally at an end, seemed lost. The fire in his eyes had dimmed, leaving behind a deep, hollow sadness. Thaddeus, who had seen the true face of violence, had lost his boyish innocence. He was quiet now, thoughtful. And Jedediah, he was just Jedediah, steady, calm. His eyes rarely left Maggie. A few days later, Rufus and Thaddeus announced they were leaving. They were heading west to California to start over. There was nothing left for them here. They said their goodbyes to Maggie, their handshakes firm, their eyes filled with a gratitude that needed no words. And then they were gone. Two figures riding off into the sunset, leaving behind only footprints in the snow. Maggie and Jedediah were alone in the cabin. The silence returned. But it was different now. It was no longer the oppressive, lonely silence of before. It was a comfortable silence, filled with unspoken possibilities. They spent the next few weeks repairing the cabin, tending the animals, falling into a simple domestic rhythm. They didn't talk about the future. They didn't need to. They were living it, one day at a time. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Jedediah finally spoke. "I should go," he said, his voice quiet. "This is your home. I don't belong here." Maggie looked at him, at this man who had come into her life like a storm and had somehow managed to calm the storm inside her. "Where will you go?" she asked. He shrugged. "Don't know. Just away." She thought about the silence, about the loneliness. She thought about what her life had been before him and what it could be now. "You could stay," she said, her voice so soft it was almost a whisper. He looked at her, a question in his eyes. "You could stay," she said again, her voice stronger this time. "This could be your home too, if you want it." A slow smile spread across his face, the first true smile she had ever seen from him. It transformed him, chasing away the shadows and revealing the good, kind man underneath. "I think I'd like that," he said. And in that moment, Maggie Holloway knew she was no longer alone. The snow still fell, the wind still howled, but inside her small cabin, a new fire was burning, bright and warm and strong enough to last a lifetime. Justice isn't always about a badge or a noose. Sometimes it's about burying the ghosts of the past and finding the courage to build a new future. It's about a lonely woman who found her strength, and three broken men who found a home. And it all happened in a little cabin, in the middle of a snowstorm, on a mountain full of secrets. What did you think of Maggie's story? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this journey into the dark and mysterious, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next strange tale.